We spoke a lot about the definitions of sound painting, the way in which it's used, but what we haven't spoke about is the audience very much. So what type of people or art enthusiasts come to sound painting?
I think my experience is that anybody, any and everybody enjoys, I mean this is a pretty broad statement, so I don't mean to be so flippant, thank you. But I mean, to tell you a quick story, when I first brought sound painting to Europe, it was through Ed Sareth and Dave Liebman, who invited me to give a conference and be a part of a conference and give a demonstration of sound painting in Santiago de Compostela in Spain. This is at the end of the 90s. And then afterwards, I went to Barcelona, and I was part of the Lim Festival, and they had organized a group for me. And so this was the first time I was going to present sound painting in Spain, and so I was in rehearsal that afternoon. It was just one afternoon of rehearsal, only have a chance to teach some about 40, 45 signs, enough to make a good piece. And I was doing this at a church, in the courtyard of a church in Barcelona. And then I went out to get something to eat after rehearsal, and I came back, and I noticed a lot of elderly people, sort of the blue hair crowd, if you will. I like the blue hair thing. And so there was nothing but elderly people, and I thought they were going to like a Sunday evening mass, And so I went to the courtyard where the orchestra was set up and getting ready to start the performance. So I walked out to start, and the public was there, and the public was all of these elderly people. And I thought, they're going to kill me. I'm going to be hung by the toes, in the town square. And so I did, and I think the best art comes from honesty. And so I was honest in my approach to the sound painting. I didn't feel like the people were inhibiting me in any such way. And I did my work. And even in the end, I scanned the public and whatnot, and I got a great response from them. So I was, so who does the sound painting appeal to? I think I say everybody because I don't think the audience necessarily has to have like an education, to understand contemporary music. Like back in the 50s and 60s, and first coming to hear Stockhausen, maybe it turned a lot of people off who had never heard anything like that. And they, maybe themselves, they thought, oh, I need to go get an education in contemporary art.
So
I don't think that's true.
It's inclusive. I mean, part of the reason for me asking the question extends to all the sound painters like ourselves who say, how do you advertise your ensemble or your performance in terms of getting an audience? Do you need to say sound painting in the title? Of course, no, you don't. A lot of ensembles do say they are a sound painting ensemble and give a name to it, but essentially you don't need to do that if the word doesn't mean anything to the potential audience.
Yeah, how do you advertise? I mean, that's the question?
Yeah.
I mean, I think today, I often use the word sound painting in somewhere in the publicity. I mean, the people that are organizing the performances for me will use sound painting in there, and of course a CV or a bio or something about, a description of sound painting and whatnot for those that don't know it. But right now, most groups are including the word sound painting in their advertisement of the performance. I think 50 years from now that will be necessary. I mean, sound painting is a tool, it's not a style.
Exactly.
But
yeah.
I think right now it's important in a way to say that that's how it's going to be. I mean, it's like John Zorn's Cobra. But the name of the piece is Cobra, and it's actually a specific, set of rules, but still the results are always different. And Cobra is a wonderful signing system. It's but John advertises as Cobra. So I mean, sound painting is not a piece; it's a tool. But to get the audience to kind of understand what they're coming to and what they're going to see, a lot of people use sound painting to explain, that this is the tool that's going to, produce the composition. there's something exciting about that.
Yeah.
That you know you're going to go and see somebody compose in real time.
Yeah. Okay, well, so there are quite a few of the sound painters, myself included, are working in countries where we apply for funding for research and we have to justify what we do. And one of those things that we often have to justify is the cultural value of arts, and in this case particularly sound painting. So what is the cultural value of sound painting as a creative language?
Well, I think when you ask me that question, I think the first thing I would say is that anybody can be a part of a sound painting group.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to education, speaking of education, you know, we don't need to have music instruments, or we don't need to have a black box theater, or we don't need to have a dance room. Creativity or forms in the performing arts like music and dance and theater can be taught on a very low budget, a very low budget with sound painting. I mean, in today's days of austerity, we need anyway. So we could use something like that.
You've still got two issues in there because you've instantly gone to education. So you're saying it has it's open to diversity, regardless of background, demography, economic income, whatever.
Exactly.
You can be open to it from wherever somebody is from. It's absolutely breaking down all the boundaries, and at the same time, you can train this with absolutely no extra facilities. But on the other hand, if you have the instruments, you've got a professional orchestra, you can still do something with that group as well and generate something from them. So
Absolutely.
so part of this cultural value, of course, is your aspiration to retain quality, as you said, within the accreditation process, and in really checking that people know how to use the language and use it in such a way that they're proficient and fluent, because you clearly aspire for a quality musical dance theatre performance.
Right. Yes.
We've spoken a little bit about personal styles and that this has worked out in a number of different cultures. There's a thriving base of sound painting in France and in Spain. There's a growth of it in England and of course within Sweden. How do people bring their own identity, their own sort of personal value to sound painting?
Well, one is I don't think they have a choice. I mean, I think that first they have to get past the point that they're fluent with the language, that they're fluid with the movement. And at that point, they just speaking about their body and how it's communicating, the ideas to the group. You'll see with different sound painters, the signing kind of becomes more personal. How they give the play gesture, how they give an off gesture, how they phrase. I mean, sometimes I watch, so eventually their personality comes into, that person, they become a part of the language becomes a part of them. And I've learned so much from people that have only been sound painting 1 or 2 years, and sometimes they'll make up a phrase that's obviously something that really is attractive to them, that wasn't necessarily attractive to me, that I had never thought of, and that I learned from. I go, oh, okay, there's something interesting I have not. It's been right there in front of my face if I want to try to go in and explore and put things together and see what I can come out with a phrase. It's been right there in front of my face, but I've never thought about doing it, and here's a person that's done that, and it's just using basic language or maybe some second level language. And I'm surprised to go, oh wow, because,
So the personal voice can always be projected. I mean, more than that, as you said earlier in the discussion, in the use of palettes, you can integrate folk music through oral tradition, you can bring in and cite and quote phrases of literature, you can use installations and settings. So if you wanted to do a culturally specific performance, my understanding is that you can insert sound painting into that. So in what ways is sound painting perhaps used hip-hop or bebop or a classical tradition, or sound painted maybe a genre like a passion play, for example?
Mm-hmm. In what ways is it used?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the tool to put that piece together. I mean, simply put. I mean, I've done. I took Haydn Concerto and C for cello and chamber orchestra, and I made a sound painting out of it. With Gil Selinger and I worked together on this with a pickup freelance orchestra in New York City, and I mean, it's not the Haydn Concerto, but it's the Haydn Concerto put back together by Soundpainting in a much different way. So it's not Haydn's work anymore. It's my work influenced by Haydn's work and the use of some of Haydn's notation.
To become a response to it and a
to become like a response to that, because I like the piece and sort of my interpretation of the piece. Mm-hmm. So yes, you can take in, so you're in some, you know, in a culture where you want to take in, like I'm hoping to do a sound painting workshop and performance in India in 2015. I haven't been there yet to teach and to compose and work there. But it looks like that's what's going to happen, and that's going to be very fascinating for me, that the musicians are going to be playing different instruments than, say, that I might find here in France or Sweden or wherever in the United States. There'll be a different set of instruments. And I think that's fascinating for both the composer and the group. And here's a language that it's the same language I'm using with groups in France or in New York or wherever, but now I'm applying this language to another culture.
So because it's a tool, it's like you've got a toolbox, you can pull these signs out, you can create a quality performance that breaks down boundaries, that integrates everybody, it's inclusive of all levels, all ability. It can foster social mobility in many ways. It's accessible for those that are visually or orally impaired. There's ways to deal with that as well, or physically impaired, and it transgresses the cultural boundaries, but at the same time doesn't ignore those. It allows you to use cultural specifics should you wish to. It allows you to consider homage to previous composers or artists, while at the same time pushing forwards to create something new, which is the essence of creativity, constantly pushing forward what we're able to create and to achieve.
Right, and it's why I keep, some people have, sound painting's very young, it's not even 50 years old, and so it's a very young language, and some people who don't understand it, critics of sound painting will say that, it's kind of like a style or something. What you just said, it can do all of those things because it's not a style, it's a tool. We can use a hammer in multiple situations, and this is a tool in a sense.
Including in sound painting. Yeah.
Including in sound painting.
So it might be worth just thinking about where sound painting has gone to emphasise this cultural value, because if it was a style, it might not move as freely across borders and across sort of demographics. But it exists, obviously, we've said United States, United Kingdom, Ireland.
It's like 45 countries or something.
Exactly. So where's it most newly integrated, shall we say? Or there might be a single sound painter or a couple of sound painters really grabbing onto the.
I mean, newly integrated in China and in Tanzania and in countries in Africa, yeah. and also in countries in South America like Chile and Uruguay and Venezuela. It's now growing more in those countries, yeah. And in Iran, also in Iran, which I'm very happy for, and I mean Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. Those countries have been having sound painting for 7 or 8 years now. Yeah.
Which is wonderful. So we're really getting across all those political boundaries that other things might not necessarily infiltrate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Walter.
You're welcome, thank you.
I think we should talk a little bit about copyright and ownership. We've spoken at length previously, of course, about this, but originally you copyrighted the signs and then you released that copyright, and now you've very much got a policy of this being a universal language. So can you say something about why you copyrighted the signs and why you've removed that?
Well, yeah, I mean, my material is copy. It has a copyright. I mean, that's my workbooks and dictionary and glossary and all that stuff is copyrighted. Mm-hmm. And but earlier on, I didn't. So that still is.
Yeah, yeah.
But what I did early on was I put a trademark next to sound painting.
Yeah.
Sound painting TM, trademark, before I was looking to get the name registered. You have to go through the trademark process first and then registration. And I did that at the advice of my lawyers and in New York City. And I listened to them, and I mean, I thought, yeah, okay, and I'll put a trademark on it. They know what they're talking about. But then, after after some time in wrestling with myself about this whole idea of I own this, you know, I thought this is ridiculous. I don't own it. It's a language. I happen to be the one that created it. But it's not going to be a language if I'm the only one speaking it, you know. So I want to share this with whoever is interested in using it, and I hope many are, as it's turned out lots of people are using it. But at the time, I wanted to share it with whoever wanted to use it, and I didn't want to, you know, put any roadblocks up for people, you know, like here's a restriction, like this is trademark. So right away, people think, oh, we need to ask Walter if we can use sound painting. The language wouldn't grow, so I removed the trademark.
Yeah. So it's open for anyone to use, but obviously then there's still a lot of primary source material of your own with the workbooks. There's 3 out, 4 and 5 in process. You've got the dictionary, you've got the glossary. You've also got the commercial release performances, the open source performances, and a number of interviews of you on the radios and things in different festivals. There's plenty of material there. Good. Let's talk about your expectations and the future of sound painting for a moment. You've been working with this language for quite some time now. What are your expectations for a group that has a long-standing experience, so like the Walter Thompson Orchestra? When you sign whole group minimalism, go or beat in, you've got an idea of what that group's going to give you. So could you tell me something about the familiarity that you have with your group and how that affects your use of the language?
Yeah, I mean, there's something, you know, it's one thing to go in and work have a few rehearsals with a new set of people and then do a concert, you know. That's extremely exciting to constantly change the instrument, so to speak. The group is the instrument for the sound painter, right? And then it's another thing to have a group and to know the people and to sort of, to be a family in a way where, you know, this creative family that we're challenging each other all the time, certainly. But there's many times where we can say to each other, oh yes, you did that again, you know. And they do that with me too, like, you know, Gil Selinger will say, oh, I knew where Walter was going to go with that. And I'm sure the rest of the performers feel the same way, and sometimes I feel like I know where they're going to go. But at the same time, there's a comfort level. They're very fluent with the language. So
they're much quicker to respond, I would think, with point to point as soon as you
snap
or hits, they're very quick. But I'm also thinking that once you know...
But just to say that there's something about that that's really important. They're very quick to respond, but the reason they are is because they're so comfortable with the language, and this is one of the things some other students of mine have pointed out to me that have seen my group and seen me sound paint with my group, is they said, they don't seem to even really be watching you, kind of. They don't seem to be like staring intently at you like a lot of younger groups, younger in the language, knowledge of the language, where they will just, what's next? What does that mean? And kind of, you know, translating each gesture to, oh yes, oh okay. You know, but with my group and other groups that have been around a long time, like Spoons, you know, and the Swedish Soundpainting Orchestra and Zaha, and different groups that have been around for a long time, the phrase, whether it be simple or complex, is so readily understood that the performer can offer numerous choices, so they don't feel inhibited by the fluidity or the fluency that they have. You know, they're totally fluent.
So for the performer, it's fluency. For the sound painter, the composer, I'm thinking if you're aware of how somebody might respond, it might change your gestures. Because we both know people from the last think tank that when you sign something, you've got an idea of where they're going to go. So you almost modify what you might sign or what you might not in terms of over the top or complexity. You know that that's going to mean something different for each person, and you modify it accordingly in a sense. Do you find that a restriction? Do you find that something exciting, an opportunity?
Well, I understand what you're saying, and I try to, even though I know my players, just speaking of my group, because that would be a good group to answer this question with, even though I might know where Rolf Sturm is going to go a little bit, I don't really.
Yeah.
Even though I know where Lise Walker's going to go, I don't really, because she might give me 1/50th. I mean, I recognize 1/50th of what she's doing. So that's the familiar part. There it is again, kind of. But the rest of the time, these are sound painting performers that are fully fluent in the language and know to give something different and challenge me. They're basically going after giving me something like, you know, I've opened up a door for them. I've given them a gesture that has these parameters, and they can fill that gesture hundreds of different ways. So I honestly sort of never know most of the time where they're going to go. I mean, it's kind of like, you know, what Duke Ellington said, you know, he would compose for his orchestra because he knew kind of like what the people could do, you know. And in some sense, I have that.
So you're constantly expanding what they're able to do. You know the professionals.
And they're constantly expanding. Like, let me give this to Walter. And so they're constantly changing and growing and evolving artists, all of them. And they will they're incredibly fine sound painting performers. So they are going to just, you know, something comes up in their life that they find interesting, and it finds its way through their discipline and out to me. So there's always something new coming from them. I really never get bored.
So it's a good message to other live composers that are newer in their craft, shall we say, that continue to be challenged by what you might expect and don't assume that you're going to get the same thing, always take it further.
Yeah, and if you do with your group, if you are receiving a lot of the same material, then you need to go back in rehearsal and tell them, you know, do point to point with change and really work the group until they give you, you know, till they're really offering new ideas all the time. And that's the challenge for the sound painting performer.
I think the challenge is, as you said, the new ideas, because we spoke before that musicians can, with new groups, offer complementary or similar material, whereas actors, dancers are quite more able and more familiar with offering contrast. So perhaps to avoid this sense of Mickey Mousing or one thing parallelism another, to really use change and to constantly fire that at a group to get something that isn't similar.
Yeah, constantly. I mean, that's the way I rehearse a group before a performance. And just to take one tiny little step back to, you know, working with children and whatnot, I was, doing like an improvisation with my daughter, who has just now turned 4. Kaylee's just turned 4. And maybe 5 or 6 months ago, we were just making sounds back and forth to each other, and she really knew that we were improvising. No doubt it doesn't know the word in that sense. She never repeated herself. I think I would repeat myself before she did. And this goes back to that what I was saying about children are naturally creative.
They're naturally able to be flexible, yeah.
She did not ever repeat herself for 15 minutes. And not one repetition, and not one.
Keeping you on your toes.
Kept me on my toes, yes.
Good. So coming towards the end of our discussion, let's consider issues of performance practice and the way in which sound painting is being used. We've said there are many ways of using sound painting, that each sound painter might have their own style, or a group might have a particular focus or an agenda that they're using, that you can impose or leave things as open as possible. But you've sort of established there are 2 schools, so my question is going to be really broad, but can you identify what these sort of 2 schools of thought are, how they're identified, and what your opinion is on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's my own sort of way of looking at the growth of sound painting, and I created the 2 schools, and, you know, to just sort of, in a way, to say that, you know, that the language is growing, and it's not only growing one way, it's being used in many different ways, but there's a basic sort of 2 schools of thought. It's what I call the technics and the chancers, and one is not better than the other. I don't mean anything as such. A technic is somebody who is very interested in complex phrases, and before they even go to rehearsal, they have a command of the language, and before they go to rehearsal, they might like fill out different complex phrases and go to the rehearsal and do more imposing of their phrases. You know, I like this, I'm going to rehearse this, and this have 10, 15, 20 different phrases. This isn't necessarily how a technique always works, but in their mind, they're thinking in a much more complex way. Their phrases are much more complex.
Aspiring for complexity.
They're aspiring for complexity, or aspiring for even, maybe not even just complexity, but detail. Like, how do I get this to happen? How do I get that to happen? How do I get this to happen? And it's that question they're asking themselves, how do I get that to happen? How do I get that to happen? That question that you're putting to yourself when you're sitting there wondering about your sound painting composition, the fact that you're putting that question to yourself makes you a technic. Because, and so that's what the technique does. The technique goes and they impose their idea, you know. Yep. Often there's a lot more imposition of idea. And the chancers, so-called, the chancer group of sound painters, of course everybody's a mix of both, and some people more than others. So I'm a mix of both, of course. But I rarely sit back and say, how am I going to do this, how am I going to do that? As a chancer, the chancer makes the first sign and then doesn't think how they're going to do the next thing, but just does it. Yeah. Because both can have a great knowledge of the language.
There's a difference between theory and application. One person can do and learn from doing and then reflect on it, analyse and learn each time they do. Someone else can learn by writing down the phrase, thinking about it, then imposing it, whether it's practice-led, practice-based, what have you. And it's for them, for the person that writes it down ahead of time, that's their desire to use the language in that manner. I mean, it's in a way, it's closer to traditional composing. Yeah. When you're doing that, it's much closer, but the language is open to be used however you want. You know, the way we use the English language, you just put one word on the sign and the sign is stop. I mean, that's not the entire English language, but it works wonderfully for just stop. You know, so people want to use sound painting in a little bit of a way that kind of blends traditional composing, ideas with live composing ideas. That's fine, and those people I call techniques, and I think that fork in the development of sound painting is just important as the other fork. Yeah, but the majority obviously move between. I think what you're clearly iterating by talking about these two schools is different ways of developing your own style, and as a live composer thinking, what is it I do and why do I do what I do? Because one thing we've not said yet in this discussion is you've got 4 sections in your syntax, but actually it's the 5th section of why does the sound painter do what they do, and that why falls very much into the ways in which you're thinking in live activity.
Right, to be clear, the sound painter, the syntax for the sound painter, right? Mm-hmm. Who, what, how, when, why. And there's no why gesture, but it's here. You know, this is part of it. You know, when all of that is done, the syntax has been, signed, the why has to come into. Yeah. Why did you do that? And I think that's part of the assessment we were speaking about before. And
it's the assessment if you're trying to check that somebody can teach or learn sound painting, but I think it's also your personal reflection. I mean, I mentioned the very traditional educational model that you impose something, you reflect on it, you change it, you do it again. But part of yourself in thinking backwards and forwards, you've got to think, how am I going to use it? Why am I doing this? How am I going to bring it back? The why and the how are constantly working in tandem, aren't they?
Absolutely. The why is always there. It's always there.
Because as much as we're talking about chances or techniques, no one's a complete chance, because we're not constantly saying, whole group improvised, off you go, I'm leaving you.
No.
And we're not also saying, there's my score with all my gestures written down. So it's just a way in which to think about where you're situating yourself at each moment in a piece.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
In a very positive way rather than the negative.
Exactly.
Yeah. Walter, would you like to end with a passionate plea to the sound painters and aspiring sound painters out there?
Yeah, I guess if I could wrap it up in one simple sentence, I would like to say to anybody pursuing sound painting, as a composer in this case, and a performer, simply say that to work with the known and the unknown and to make art out of it.
Thank you.
Welcome.